Good day. The first thing I need to do before I get into the main topics of this program is to apologise for the strange lighting conditions. Briefly, I'm travelling to London today, and that means that I have to make this video very early, and that explains the difficult lighting. It also means that, of course, I'm not going to be fully up to date with the events over the course of the whole day. It could be that there's going to be all kinds of developments over the course of the day about which I'm not going to be fully informed. But there it is. I will try to catch up in the video I do later, bringing an update of the situation that has evolved over the course of today, as well, of course, as it stands on the morning of tomorrow, of the day of tomorrow. So let me, first of all, go back to discussing that key central issue, which is the pivotal point of the entire global conflict that's now evolving, which is the conflict in Ukraine and the military situation there. And the Russian Defense Ministry has now formally confirmed that the main focus of the fighting is in Bakhmut, and that the priority that is being given now by the Russian military is the ending of this long siege of Bakhmut. And this is what the Russian Ministry of Defense, in its daily review of the situation in Ukraine, has said. In the Donetsk direction, the main forces of the Russian troops were concentrated near the city of Artyomovsk. Artyomovsk, as I've said many times, is actually the city which is referred to in Ukraine as Bakhmut, but the Russians continue to use the old Soviet name for this city, which is Artyomovsk. And before very long, I will revert to calling it Artyomovsk as well, once it comes under the Russian control. As I've said many times, my practice is to refer to a city using the place name of the country, the political system which controls it. For the moment, I will continue to refer to it as Bakhmut, but the Russian Ministry of Defense calls it Artyomovsk. And then it goes on to say the following: the Wagner assault groups continued fighting to seize blocks in the central part of Artyomovsk and push the enemy to the western outskirts of the settlement. On the flanks, the assault teams are supported by the airborne troops. That's an important piece of information that they've provided, that the Russian Defense Ministry has provided, that the Wagner organization forces are now concentrated in Bakhmut itself. They're engaging in the street fighting there, and that the Russian airborne troops, the paratroopers, are covering the flanks. Now that's something which we'll see Prigozhin himself, the head of the Wagner organization, has confirmed. And note that the Russian Ministry of Defense speaks of fighting continuing in the central parts of Artyomovsk, Bakhmut in other words. We've heard from various reports elsewhere that in fact the Wagner organization is in full control of the center of Bakhmut, but it is in fact the practice of the Russian Ministry of Defense to delay announcing, confirming that this is the case by a few days until a particular territory that's been seized, control of that territory has been fully consolidated. And then the Russian Ministry of Defense rounds off its discussion of the fighting in Bakhmut with these words: missile troops and artillery of the Yug group of forces and operational tactical aviation provide air and fire support to the offensive. over the past 24 hours, aircraft flew 11 sorties close to Artyomovsk, and the missile troops and artillery carried out 48 firing missions for this purpose. The enemy's losses amounted to over 450 Ukrainian troops and mercenaries, 3 tanks, 3 infantry fighting vehicles, 6 armoured fighting vehicles, D-20 and a Star B howitzers, as well as 2 US-made TPQ-50 radar stations over the past day in this direction. So here we see that the Russians, this is the Russian Ministry of Defense now, is claiming that in the 24-hour period before this report was published, which was today, 450 Ukrainian troops and what they call mercenaries, that's to say contract fighters principally from the West, were either killed or injured or in any event put out of action in Bakhmut. Now that is an exceptionally high toll for any military unit, any military force to suffer in one place in one day. It gives a sense of the intensity of the fighting in Bakhmut. Now, of course, these are Russian Ministry of Defense figures. They're not confirmed by Ukraine. They're not confirmed by Western reports. We have no way independently of knowing how true or not they are. But as I've said many times, I've gradually come round to the view that in general, with some qualifications, reports of casualties inflicted on Ukraine by the Russian Ministry of Defense tend to be reasonably accurate. That doesn't mean that every single figure they give is correct. Sometimes they've given figures which are obviously wrong. On one occasion recently, when they claimed a retaliatory strike following a successful HIMARS missile strike on a building housing Russian reservists, which killed around, well, from memory, it was about, well, it was anyway, a large number of reservists. I don't remember the exact figure, but they claimed that 600 Ukrainian troops had been killed in that retaliatory strike. I made it fairly clear at the time that I thought that claim by the Russian Ministry of Defense was wholly fictitious. I don't think it is on this occasion. I think this is a figure which, if we are not going to entirely rely upon, we should nonetheless take seriously. The other point to note about this report, however, is that it refers to operational tactical aviation providing air support. Now, we hear that aircraft flew 11 sorties close to Bakhmut and carried out various airstrikes. Now, I'm going to guess that these are Sukhoi 25 fighter bombers, or rather ground attack aircraft, rather than the Sukhoi 34 and Sukhoi 35 and Sukhoi 30 bombers and fighter jets that have been dropping these heavy bombs, these 1,500 kilo precision-guided bombs that I've been talking about in recent programs. Having said that, it can't be entirely discounted that some of these more powerful aircraft with these heavier bombs have been operating near Bakhmut. It's impossible to say, but I think that the reference to tactical aviation, as I said, suggests ground attack aircraft. But we see that the Russian Air Force is active around Bakhmut. So, that's what the Russian Ministry of Defense has said. Now, Prigozhin himself has actually been speaking, and he's published a recent statement, and this is what he has said. We have turned over control over the flanks in Bakhmut to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Today, the units of the Ministry of Defence, including the airborne troops, took both the right and left flanks. As far as I know, they have everything they need to organise defence and conduct defensive actions if necessary. Therefore, today, Zaliznianskoye, Sako and Vanseti, Nikolaevka and other settlements that have been stormed by units of the Wagner organization in recent months, they are in the area of responsibility of the airborne forces and other units of the Ministry of Defence. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I believe that this has been the case for some weeks. I think that though Wagner organization troops have indeed been operating in these villages and in other villages in and around Bakhmut, I believe that it is for some time that the Russian Ministry of Defence has deployed regular Russian troops to support the Wagner forces in and around Bakhmut, and this is the first confirmation of this from Prigozhin. Prigozhin, until recently, has claimed that it is only the Wagner organization troops that are fighting in and around Bakhmut. He's now, perhaps somewhat grudgingly, conceded that this is not the case. He accepts that it's the Russian military, the Russian regular military, that are guarding his flanks, and he's trying to make it seem as if this is something that has only just happened. He says that it's only today that certain settlements have been transferred to the regular Russian military. But I've heard about this now for some time, and I believe that this is in fact been true for some time, as I've just said. Now, can I just say that this confirmation from Prigozhin about the role of the regular Russian army suggests that whatever previous issues existed between him and the regular Russian military, and between the Wagner organization and the regular Russian military, that those issues have now been resolved. I suspect that the actual commanders, battlefield commanders of the Wagner organization, have been working closely with Russian Defense Ministry troops throughout the fighting in Bakhmut. The fact that there's been issues, personal issues, between Prigozhin and the regular Russian military, the general staff in particular, for some time, I think has not had actually any significant effect on the situation on the ground. I just wanted to make that point because I want to make this clear, and it seems to me that there's been some kind of agreement both by the Defense Ministry and by the military chiefs of the Wagner organization to make clear that it is in fact the regular Russian military that is guarding the flanks. And it's clear to me that these two statements, the one I read before from the Russian Defense Ministry and this one by Prigozhin, have been coordinated. Anyway, Prigozhin then goes on to discuss the situation in Bakhmut itself. In our turn, we are fully focused on Bakhmut. So it's now clear that the bulk of Wagner organization troops are concentrated in the street fighting in Bakhmut. And he goes on to say the part of the city where we continue to carry out our combat missions. More than 80% of the city is under our control, including all administrative centres, factories, plants, city administration, as you know. Now, Prigozhin says this statement is translated to say more than 80%. I read an earlier report, an earlier translation of this same statement of Prigozhin, which said that he said 85%. Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional administration, put it at 75%. Other reporters from the ground say that the Russians control 90% of Bakhmut. I don't think this statistics, these percentages matter very much. They clearly control the bulk of Bakhmut. Now, over the last couple of hours, we've had denials from Ukrainian military officials. The spokesman of the Ukrainian forces that are defending Bakhmut says that he's spoken to the battlefield commander who's in charge of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. He has insisted that Ukraine controls more of Bakhmut than these reports allege. The British media, Reuters, The Guardian, The Telegraph, all of these places are saying that Prigozhin has made premature claims of Russian gains in the past. I cannot recall a single instance where Prigozhin has in fact made premature claims of Russian gains. On the contrary, he's been extremely careful to refute claims made by others of premature gains in any particular location. So I take Prigozhin to be accurate about this. I'm going to say something else. The last time Prigozhin spoke, he said that 75% of Bakhmut was under Russian control, and he also said that the Russians had taken control of the regional administration building and raised their flag there. And then Reuters made exactly the same point. After the Ukrainians again denied this assertion by Prigozhin, Reuters said that Prigozhin is in the habit of making premature claims, and in fact, photographic evidence appeared just a few hours later that confirmed the truth of what he had said and confirmed the fact that the administration building had indeed been captured by the Russians and that they had indeed raised their flag there. Whilst I'm on the topic of this administration building, I would say that Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Donetsk regional government and who's just toured Bakhmut, and who has undoubtedly met Prigozhin, and who I suspect has acted as something of a peacemaker between Prigozhin and the Russian Defense Ministry. Anyway, Pushilin claims that one of the reasons the city administration building, the regional administration building, was in the ruined condition that it appears in the photographs is that before they retreated from it, the Ukrainian military tried to blow it up. And though they weren't able to destroy the entire structure, they did inflict significant damage, but that the damage that we see on that building was intentional. So anyway, that is what Prigozhin has said about the extent of Russian control over Bakhmut. And then he rounds out his statement. There are the residential areas left with apartment buildings where Ukrainians fortify their positions. There are tunnels under these apartment buildings. As I said before, the 3D war continues. Here is the part of Bakhmut that is left under Ukrainian control. So the fighting still goes on. The earlier reports by Radovka that the fighting in Bakhmut was all but ended, it's now clear, are premature. We've seen the statements from the Russian Defense Ministry. We've seen the statement from Prigozhin. It's clear that the Russians are in control of all the major positions in Bakhmut, but it seems that they probably still don't control the avant-garde stadium, and there are still some residential apartment complexes in the west of the town that remain under Ukrainian control. By the way, I understand that the earlier report that the area under Ukrainian control, its circumference is around 5 kilometers, is about correct, and that gives us a sense of the intensity of the fighting that is going on, the fact that the Russians are able to shell every part of this building, not just with heavy artillery, but with mortars and all those kind of things. And the fact of this enormous volume of every kind of artillery being deployed and used in this relatively small area no doubt explains why Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut itself are so high. 450 in a single day, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. Quite likely, very possibly, some of these, of course, have also been killed along those roads, those asphalt roads that lead into the town. And I've discussed the harrowing nature of the fighting in previous programs. So anyway, that is the situation in Bakhmut. There's also been a lot of reports from the Russians about Marinka. The Russians claim now, finally, that they've captured the entire factory area, the industrial area of Marinka, and they are now suggesting that this is actually where the major fortified positions that the Ukrainians had set out in Marinka were located. And it is indeed the case that in these Donbass towns, these small industrial towns that crisscross Donbass, it's often these big Soviet-era factories, enormously strongly built with large industrial buildings, that the Ukrainians have converted into their major fortified positions. And it's indeed highly plausible that the Ukrainians heavily fortified those positions in and around Marinka, these factory buildings in and around Marinka. Anyway, the Russians now finally say that they managed to bring the entire industrial area of Marinka under their full consolidated control, and that they're now confident that they'll be able to capture the rest of the town. Now, again, the Russians have made premature claims to have captured this town before, which turned out to be wrong. A couple of days ago, they were again insinuating that they controlled around 90% of the town. They've now lowered the percentage to about 75%. That it's clear this is mainly residential. And they're now talking about the fighting of in Marinka finally coming towards some kind of conclusion. Now, if this is indeed the case, then this is an important development because, as I've said on previous occasions, if Marinka is captured by the Russians, the even more important town of Vuhledar to the southwest, which is connected to Marinka, becomes vulnerable. It can be attacked from from two sides. It'll become much more difficult for Ukraine to hold on to its positions in Vuhledar. And of course, if Vuhledar is captured by the Russians can then reactivate a spur of the railways, the Donbass railways that operate through Donbass, consolidating their control over southern Donbass and positioning themselves in an area, in a location where they would be able to disrupt any Ukrainian offensive southwards towards the Black Sea. So these are important battles, and they're shaping out, and we're beginning to get today, over the last 24 hours, rather more information, rather more concrete information as to precisely what is going on. So, still a lot of fighting to do. There are continuing reports that Ukraine is very slowly pulling troops out of Bakhmut, but it's clear that to the extent that they can continue to defend the town, they are doing so. And I suspect, in light of these recent reports that we've just seen from Prigozhin and from the Russian Defense Ministry, the primary reason why Ukraine is pulling troops out of Bakhmut, however slowly it is doing it, is because the area under its control is now too small, and that keeping a large body of men there simply creates more targets for the Russian artillery without adding anything to the capability of the defense. Now, that, of course, is my own opinion. I'm not a military person. Others might disagree with that. Anyway, so there's fighting still going on in both Bakhmut and Marinka, but as I've discussed in recent programs, the trajectory of the fighting in both of these places is very clear. So there's been a lot of reports now about that report that appeared that I discussed in my recent video, last video in the Washington Post, that the Pentagon is now deeply skeptical that Ukraine has enough men and machines to achieve the kind of breakthrough that it's looking for in this offensive that it's planning to conduct in Zaporozhye region. Now, I'm not going to discuss this further, but I will say that Aksyonov, who is the head of the Crimean regional government, has now come out and made certain comments about the prospect of the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive. He's talked about the fact that the Russians have built up extremely strong, layered, he says, modern defense lines, both in Kherson and Zaporozhye region, those parts of those regions which they control, and in Crimea itself. He says that he doesn't expect the Ukrainians to reach the fortifications in Crimea, but it's right that the Russians should take precautions by building fortifications there. He says that the Russians are ready for anything that the Ukrainians do. He seemed confident that the Russians are able to repel this offensive. And I have to say that all the various Russian officials who've been commenting about the prospect of this offensive have been talking in much the same way, from people like Kadyrov to Aksyonov to others like Yan Gagin, Pushilin, all of them. They all seem to be confident that this offensive, if it comes, that Russia will be able to weather it and will be able, in effect, to defeat it. Well, we will see. As I said, they're confident. The Pentagon apparently isn't. That article that I discussed a few days ago by Mr. Earl Mack in The Hill suggests that he's not very confident about it either. And it also suggests that the Ukrainian officials that he spoke to in Kiev are not confident about it too. Well, we shall see. I expect, by the way, that the offensive will now begin towards the end of April, though obviously, again, I can't be sure. So that's where we are. We have all of this information on the battlefronts. Now, I'm going to now turn to this other big area that's been, for some reason, rather a lot discussed about over the last few days, and that is the Russian economy. I did a recent program, in one of my recent programs, I've discussed the issue of the ruble, which some people have been getting, I think, unduly excited about, the fact that it's weakened. I've just made many comments about the budget situation in Russia. I have said that I think that the indicators, in fact, suggest an expanding economy in Russia. The fact that imports appear to be growing point to renewed and returning growth. And there's a program which will soon come out on the Duran, in which I discuss these topics with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, in which I look into the issue of the ruble, explain the dynamics of the ruble's movements. I've also touched on the budget situation slightly, but I've said that the fact that the imports into Russia seem to be growing, which is one of the reasons why the ruble has softened. I said that points to an accelerating economy in Russia. And perhaps the best informed Russian of all has now said as much as well. And that is none other than Putin himself. And he did that over the course of a meeting on economic issues, which took place virtually. It was a virtual conference, and various important people were there. The Prime Minister Mishustin, the First Deputy Prime Minister Andrei Belousov, who's the man, by the way, in overall control of the economy, the Deputy Prime Minister Marat Khusnulin, who is involved heavily in construction matters, Maxim Oreshkin, the former economics minister, who is one of Putin's key economics advisors, Maxim Reshetnikov, who is Russia's current economics minister, Anton Siluanov, who is the finance minister, and the central bank governor Elvira Nabiullina. Before I proceed, I would point out one person who is not mentioned as attending this meeting is Sergei Glaziev, another of Putin's advisors on economics questions. He gets an awful lot of attention in the West. Some people see him as the architect of Russian economic policy during the era of sanctions. I don't myself think that, and the fact that he isn't attending these key meetings suggests that his position is still not as influential as some people would like to believe. Anyway, I just mentioned that in briefly. So, anyway, let's go to what Putin says. And he says this. I'm now quoting directly from the Kremlin website, which provides a transcript of his comments, an English language transcript of his comments. And he says, when drafting the current budget, the government based it on a projected 2.9% decline in GDP last year and 0.8% this year. Against the backdrop of positive statistics, our colleagues have revised their estimates up significantly. Notably, the forecast for the socio-economic development for the coming years must be as objective as possible, which is important for the public administration system and the domestic economy. Positive economic trends are continuing to grow. According to operational data, retail trade has been up by almost 25% since early April. In other words, there is a surge in demand and spending. And, the shops are doing a busy trade. He then goes on to say railway loads are up as well, which again, by the way, is often a very good indicator of economic activity. It means that goods are being moved up and down the country. And he says that this is one of the most important indicators of what is happening in real life. In March, this indicator stood at about 2%, but in April it was already 3.6%, both for domestic and export transportation. Putin doesn't tell us what the base point is. Is this a year-on-year increase, or is it an increase over the previous month? I believe it is an increase over the previous month. I say that because a 2% increase in March and a 3.6% increase in April, given that last March and April were a time of crisis in the economy, might not be that impressive. But if we are seeing a 2% growth in railway activity, railway loads in March over February, and a 3% increase in April over March, then that is impressive indeed. and does indeed point to a surge in economic activity in Russia. And then he goes on to say this: there are reasons to believe that economic activity will continue to grow, which we can see from an important parameter like the Business Activity Index. In March, it stood at 56.8 points, which is the third highest figure ever, and clearly indicates the growing optimism and positive outlook of domestic business. Now, again, I am assuming that what he's referring to here is PMI figures, with PMI, our Purchasing Managers Index. It tells you what kind of purchases, forward purchases, business managers are making. If they are purchasing, if the index falls below 50, it points to a contraction. If it is over 50, it points to an expansion. 56.8% points to a strong expansion. And in fact, it is a significantly higher index than earlier ones that I have seen over the previous few months, which were around 53. So anyway, that's what I think this probably means. And he then goes on to say, it can be said that the Russian economy continues to grow fast as part of the new growth model. As of late April, Russia's GDP will have grown a lot in real terms. So what does he mean by that? What he presumably means is what we are getting positive GDP growth. I'm not going to try and guess what the amount is, but anyway, there we go. And then he talks about the budget situation. These economic dynamics are reflected in the budget indicators as well. In the first quarter of this year, the country's consolidated budget revenues exceeded 13 trillion rubles, which is in line with last year's figures. But the dynamics are good overall. Notably, non-oil and gas revenue grew by about 14%, or 1.4 trillion rubles, whilst oil and gas revenue is slightly down by about 1.3 trillion rubles, which is primarily due to the high base and pricing environment specifics on the global markets last year. Now, again, these are interesting figures, and they may explain why we are looking, firstly, at a possible budget surplus in March, though notice this has never been confirmed. I think the Russians, for various reasons, are being extremely careful about providing more budgetary information, and given that we're seeing an attempt by the United States to tighten up sanctions, that isn't surprising. But anyway, what we see Putin is saying here is that the increase in revenues from the non-oil and gas sector has actually exceeded the decline in revenue from the oil and gas sector. One has increased by 1.4 trillion rubles, the other declined by 1.3 trillion rubles. And that does suggest an improving budget situation. And if that is right, then I think we can begin to understand some of the issues about Russian budget policy. Some time ago, when I discussed this issue, I said that the Russian finance ministry appeared to have agreed to allow the oil industry to provide less funding to the budget in March, deviating from the agreed budget plan. And I think what it looks as if is happening is that the finance ministry, as it is receiving more funds from the non-oil sector, non-oil and gas sector of the economy, has the space to allow the oil and gas sector to reduce its payments to the budget. And I think this explains some of the enigmas about the budget situation in March. But anyway, we're no doubt going to find out more before long, and Putin goes on to say that the situation will change by the end of the second quarter, when oil prices will rise and extra oil and gas revenue will begin to flow into the budget. And his overall point is this: because the economy appears to be growing strongly, budget revenues are going to be higher than expected. And the result is that the government is going to have to carry out revisions to budget policy over the course of this year, because it's got to think about what it's going to do with any additional funds over and above those that had been anticipated earlier, when it was assumed that there would be a contraction. Nonetheless, he goes on to say that external risk factors for our economy have not gone away. It would be a mistake for us to ease up and let things take their course, assuming that they will take care of it themselves. We cannot afford to let this happen, and we need to constantly monitor the effectiveness of our support for industry and the industrial sectors, small and medium-sized companies, and to identify problem areas in time and promptly resolve emerging business-related difficulties and lend a hand to enterprises and labour teams. And then he takes note of the fact that there are particular problems in the car industry, timber processing industry, and in the production of chemical products and fertilizers. And he says that they're going to have to hold industry-specific meetings to think of specific solutions. He then also goes on to say, however, something quite interesting. He says, as of April 3rd, the central bank governor, in other words, Nabulina, confirmed that inflation had dropped to 3.3% in annualized terms, and it is expected to drop below 3% by the end of the month. For the first time in a long period, inflation is below the central bank's target, which of course is 4%. So now there's been an awful lot of talk about the state of the Russian economy. Well, Putin has given us a raft of figures. Sometimes we have to apply some interpretation to these figures, but they point clearly to recovery. They show inflation falling, in fact falling fast. According to him, by the end of April, inflation will be around 3%. Don't know whether it's going to stay there. With high spending in the shops, there's going to be pressure perhaps for it to rise. But all that demand is generating more supply. The civilian, industrial, manufacturing sector and the services sector are responding to this surge in demand by increasing their output. And that's the overall story that Putin is telling us. And he says that all of this resurging economic activity is causing budget revenues to increase from the non-oil sector faster than the decline we've seen over the first few months from the oil and gas sector, even though he expects that revenue from the oil and gas sector will start to rise over the next few weeks. So that's the overall picture that Putin is giving us. It's an optimistic picture. He says there's problems. Car industry has problems. Timber processing has problems. These were sectors of the economy which were very heavily import dependent. There has been some recovery, by the way, in both of those industries, especially the car industry, but we still are getting very low historic production numbers, at least in the car industry, which I know about. The chemical industry also has problems, and the chemical industry is a big sector in the overall Russian manufacturing system. So there's a lot to worry about and talk about and think about. But overall, the picture Putin is giving is an optimistic one. And to repeat it again, when there is a surge in economic activity of the kind that we're seeing, inevitably imports grow, and that is why one of the two reasons, together with a decline in oil prices, why the ruble over the last few weeks has softened. There is no more complicated explanation than that. So, we will see over the next few weeks and months whether this growth trajectory is maintained. But I think it is now increasingly likely, it's not certain, anything could happen over the next few months. There's a major recession in the West, and that will impact on Russia as well. But for the moment, looks as if the Russian economy is positioned for positive growth this year. The contraction last year was 2.1%. It's highly likely, as the IMF is saying, that we're going to see GDP growth, overall GDP growth this year. And though I don't expect inflation to remain at 3%, I think it's going to be higher than that by the end of the year. It does seem as if inflation has been brought under control. Overall, when you think about where we started, this is a pretty impressive performance for an economy that was expected to crater. Well, I am not going to say more. As I said, I'm going to be travelling to London fairly soon. More from me then. In the meantime, let me again remind you all that you can find all our videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can check out our shop, links under this video, or support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links also under our this video. If you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And of course, all that remains there is for me to wish you all a very good day and to reassure you that despite all the darkness, I will indeed be back soon.